The stories that we have in our head, we tell them to ourselves over and over. I mean, we're alone with our thoughts all day, every day. And anything that we say over and over becomes a belief. And it's how we see ourselves. And so the story that I had about myself for a long time was that I'm quiet and I'm not the person who wants to get up in front of people because I don't really have anything to say and people don't want to hear from me. And that was the story that I had until I decided I didn't want that to be my story anymore. I wanted to be able to do something that would make an impact in one way or another.
Welcome to Small Acts of Rebellion, a podcast where the unspoken narratives at the intersection of our personal and professional lives come to light. I'm your host, Heather Pridemore, your guide on this journey of discovery and defiance. Join me as we uncover the rebellious spirit that shapes our careers and lives. It's time to own your story. Are you ready?
Today's guest is Emily Garcia. Emily is a therapist and the owner of Tribe Mind Body Wellness, a counseling practice located near Denver that provides comprehensive support to individuals of all ages. Alongside leading her dedicated team, Emily is the co-host of the podcast Soul Stirred: Stories of Growth and the Human Experience, where she explores the narratives that shape our identities. She is also a dynamic keynote speaker. When speaking, Emily leverages her life experience and expertise to empower others, helping them to create changes for a better life. Her goal is to inspire positive growth and balance in the lives of others. Welcome to the show, Emily.
Hi, Heather. Thanks for having me.
So I'm excited that you're here. One, because I think mental health is really important. And so I'm glad we're going to be talking a bit about that. But as always, I love to tell people how I know my guests. And so you and I happen to be part of She Leads, which I've mentioned on this show before. The part of She Leads that I'm in, you're my president. And so it's going to be a lot of fun for us to spend some time getting to know each other better.
Yeah, it's kind of fun how we've come together and how we got here.
I always find, I think because I care so much about story, that it's really easy to connect with people. But I will also say, and this is a little bit of an unofficial plug for I have just met so many interesting folks, dynamic entrepreneurs, lots of different types of businesses, lots of different stories. But I think our group in particular has such a great connection. And someone commented recently who had visited our chapter and they said, you guys really seem to support one another. And I think that really sums up the relationship that we're all building together.
I agree. It is, we meet every other week or twice a month is what I should say. And every time I get to meet with our group, I'm so excited. And then I leave feeling like, oh, I'm refreshed. It is such an amazing group to be a part of.
I would say for anyone who doesn't maybe have a reason to join maybe you're not an entrepreneur, it's something worth finding that group of people who you can have that sort of opportunity to come together because, as Emily was just saying, it's such a great feeling to have an hour, 90 minutes to have a coffee chat or share ideas, share experiences. I think sometimes that's what most of us are getting out of it is that we're all coming from different places. But there's this sort of shared experience, these universal themes that we're all experiencing. And there's something really validating and uplifting about being able to talk to other people who are sharing a similar perspective or maybe have a different perspective on the same issue or topic that you do and being able to come together and kind of get that. I think whether you're an entrepreneur or someone who's in a more traditional, corporate or W-2 type position, you can find yourself getting isolated at times. And so I think just having that group of people that you can touch base with is really important.
Mm-hmm. We're so influenced by the people that we're around. So for me, part of what I get out of being in She Leads and the connections that I make is that there are these authentic moments with people where you find out that even though everything looks beautiful and polished on the outside, everyone is trying to figure it out. And there are times where it's up and times where it's down. And we can be honest about our struggles and also our celebrations.
I think that's an excellent segue, Emily, to talk a little bit about you because, I can imagine aspects of being a therapist are pretty similar to coaching and how you're sort of having to decide when you're in certain environments, like, which hat am I wearing? And so I would ask you, as both a therapist and someone who's been in therapy, how do you navigate the balance between professional detachment and personal empathy in, I mean, not just your client interactions, but just like your day to day?
Right? It's such a good question because when I was starting out in the mental health field, before I even became a therapist, I was nervous about how I was going to help people, but then go back at the end of the day into my own life and feel like, okay, I can enjoy my own life. And it really, part of the detachment that you're asking about is it has taken a lot of time. It took many years for me to figure out, like, is this my responsibility? Is this something I need to be able to take on in order to help my client? And what I've learned over time is when I'm face to face, when I'm in the room with whoever is in front of me, I can fully be there with them. And it's like tuning into whatever is happening with them that is part of the bigger story and what they're working on, and then being able to leave that in the room when I leave for the day. And of course, there are days where it's felt heavier and I am just like, I can feel it in my body. And I will literally, as I'm driving home or if I'm working at home and I'm walking downstairs, I'll like shake it out of my system because trauma, all the feelings are in our body. They're not just in our head. And so you just have to like find a way to let it go and go, that is something that I can come back to, but I don't need it right now.
So I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about your role as a therapist, but I thought it might be helpful for people to understand, you know, what was your personal journey to therapy? What impact has it had on your own life, both personally and professionally? Like, how did you get where you are now, Emily?
Yeah. Well, I can start out 3rd grade playground. I'm with a friend. She had told me something very personal, and I don't even know what it was at this point, but I remember helping her through it, and at the end of recess, when it was time to go back in, she turned to me and she said, "Emily, you should be a counselor when you grow up." And that totally stands out in my mind. It's like one of those moments in life where you're like, "Oh, there was something there, but I didn't know it yet." And then when I was in high school, my family went through some things, and I disclosed that my stepfather had sexually molested me, which led to law enforcement being involved and child protection. I was 15 and I was removed from my home. And my sister, who's 8 years older than me, became my kinship foster provider. During that time, while we were going to court and I was testifying against him, I was court ordered to go to therapy. Being a 15-year-old, I didn't really understand what therapy was about and didn't know if it would help me. And looking back, I needed it. I ended up in therapy with a woman named Fran, and Fran changed my life. She was supportive and also challenged me. There were a lot of times that I would be in a victim mindset and like, why me? This is just going to happen to me. I can't control anything. And I remember sitting in session with Fran over and over again and her challenging me and saying, what else is possible for you? Is that really true? Does life just happen to you? Do you have any control? And by the time I stopped seeing her regularly, I really was in a mindset of knowing what I was in control of. And yes, there were things that had happened to me, and had I been victimized, of course, no child is in control of those kinds of things. However, I came out of it going, "Oh, I'm actually capable of changing my life. I'm capable of doing bigger things." And all of that later on led me to want to be a therapist. I wanted to help people in the same way that Fran had helped me.
As you were navigating more the professional side of developing into a therapist, Emily, I'm sure you didn't just graduate high school and, just walk right into being a therapist. So what did that journey, between what you just shared with us, which was very vulnerable. Thank you for, being candid and being willing to kind of give a peek into your personal life. But what happened between there and the point where you actually started having like a regular therapy practice where you are, I mean, you aren't just solo. You're not a solo therapist. You're employing other therapists and you have multiple locations, and so you're really providing a service to the community. And so, what did that gap between there look like?
Thank you. It is a long road. When I graduated from college, I started out working as a case manager, working with adults who had chronic mental illness and co-occurring disorder, like substance use disorders. So oftentimes I would work with an adult who had schizophrenia and also a crack addiction. And my job at that point was to help people find housing, to help them get onto Social Security, to help them get benefits. And so many of my clients had been homeless and had nothing. They didn't even have a birth certificate, an ID, a Social Security card. So it was really starting from scratch. And that was probably one of the hardest jobs I've had. And also, I learned so much about how to navigate the system and how to be resourceful and help people get what they need. So I ended up there for a few years and I went back to grad school. I taught English abroad. I worked for a county doing child protection casework. And then right after I graduated, I was working at nights doing child protection. And within a month of graduating, I was offered my first job as a therapist. That was a job working for a community mental health agency and I was contracted into a middle school in Denver. I loved it. And I will say this though, let me add this in. The first 6 months of doing that job, I felt so incredibly underqualified and like I had no clue what I was doing. And pretty much 6 months to the day that I was hired, I called a caregiver for one of the kids and said, "Hey, a teacher gave me a referral for your child," and she started screaming and cussing at me on the phone, and I was like, I don't think I'm cut out to do this work." And I literally hung up the phone with her and sat at my desk and cried. And I was like, what else am I even capable of doing? But the funny thing about that's one of those moments like in life where you feel like I am horrible at what I do. And then the next day you wake up and something clicks. And so the next day I woke up and suddenly things that I hadn't been catching on to, I was. Long story short, let me skip past a little bit. I ended up being there for 11 years and managing a team of other therapists for 3.5 years of that time. And when I left community mental health, I was ready to do my own private practice. I had been kind of like in the place that a lot of people in that field get to, where I was feeling sort of like I had some burnout and I wasn't good at what I was doing anymore. I didn't feel like I was a good manager. So I left to open my private practice and I was by myself and didn't want to work with other people, had no desire to open a group practice. And it kind of organically happened. One of the women who I had worked with in that job, in my old community mental health job, reached out to me and said, "I'm thinking about starting my own private practice. Can you talk to me about it and tell me what you've done?" And I asked her to join me, and she was the first person to join my team. Fortunately, 4 years later, she's still here, and it has just kind of organically grown. And so now, like you were saying, I have a team, and we have 2 locations, and we're virtual, and we work with children and teens and adults and couples, and it's such a cool experience to be around people who love what they do, and it's like a mutually beneficial thing because I love being around them, and I think that I can provide them with the things they need to do their job well.
So, you're talking a lot about what you're bringing to your employees, but let's talk about what you're bringing your like clients, Emily. So, what is that experience like, and what is the skill set that you're bringing, and what is the benefit of clients even coming to see a therapist?
Right? There is an art and science of therapy, and I think that a lot of people end up being helpers of any kind, but particularly therapists, because they have had something happen in their lives that was hard and that they were helped through by a support system, by a therapist, by a coach, by someone who could show up and help them. And so through their own learning, which is what happened to me through my own experience, I wanted to help other people in the ways that I was helped. So with my clients now, I get to show up with the life wisdom I have, but my wisdom isn't their wisdom. And I I kind of take the perspective of I take the art of what my life experience and my natural ability to be empathetic, and then the science, which is all of the training that I do and the reading and the listening to podcasts because I love learning. And I combine those two things to go, okay, how do I help my client see things through another light? So it's called reframing. How do I help to reframe what they're experiencing so that maybe there is something, like, even if it's the tiniest tweak that will help them to live a better life, to live a life that they feel is like what they're looking for? Because oftentimes when people start therapy, they're not sure what they need, but they know there's like this wisdom inside of them that tells them, I know something can be better. Otherwise, why would you start?
So you talked a little bit about reframing, and I'm sure that when you're working with clients, you're bringing a lot of new perspective to the situation. And so the goal is really to help that client see things through a different lens. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. It's an interesting way that I go about it because sometimes I have a client in front of me and I can see the full picture. I know. And I want to be able to like be like, "Do you know what I'm seeing?" But it's such a like careful song and dance that you play in therapy because you can't tell someone what to do. None of us will make a change if someone goes, "Oh, I see what you're doing. This is what you need to do. It's XYZ." And so it's asking the right questions and allowing the client who's in the room with me to start to explore some alternatives to how they're thinking about something, alternatives to what could be done, how they can, like make the tiniest changes in their lives that will make a big impact. So, my job is really to help my clients change their lens to go, okay, well, let me try on a different lens. And is this something that will work for me? And sometimes the answer is no. Like, no, I don't like that. That's not my way of thinking. That's not my way of living in the world. And so then we just keep showing up over and over. And so I'll ask people, don't do something one time and say it won't work. Because anything we do for the first time feels awkward and weird, and we're a beginner and we don't like it. But if you do something over and over for a little while, if you still don't like it and it doesn't feel like it fits you, okay, then you change it out. But if you do something over and over, it starts to become something that you're like, okay, I could do that. And for example, let's say that I'm asking a client, I wouldn't do this, but I'm asking a client, okay, so you want to change the way that you look at food. Okay. You don't like how you're eating or your eating habits. What if you add in eating an apple or a banana once a day instead of the other thing? And if they do that over and over and over again, it leads them down a different path than if they keep with what they're doing. And so in therapy, it's going, what is like, I love breath work. And I'll ask clients to go home and do breath work. And we do it in session. And then I'll say, okay, your homework this week is to go home and you're going to practice triangle breathing or box breathing. And if you do it over and over, it does make a change in your nervous system and in how you are responding to life. And so that's a new lens. It's just creating the little things, the little shifts that people can do. And then eventually the goal is that they find the lens that they're like, this works for me. And it feels like the world is clear.
Yeah, as I'm listening to you talk, Emily, I just keep thinking about how often when people, you know, seek support, and this isn't just about therapy, this is sort of just like life general stuff, right? When we seek support, often something has triggered where we're just like, okay, now I actually like need this thing. I need some solution. I need some relief. I need something about the way I've been doing things isn't working. And I need something to help me fix whatever this problem is. Coaching's very similar. If I were to hire a physical therapist or whatever the different like modalities are, right? It's always because something has happened and I need some help. And so I'm kind of like thinking about that as you're talking, but I could also see that if I came to you and I was in that mentality, right, where it's like something bad has happened and I'm looking to my therapist or to therapy to fix whatever this like feeling I'm having or this issue that I'm having, if I'm doing like box breathing, which has probably long-term impact, but may not be the sort of like magical fix that I'm looking for, it kind of goes back to what you were saying about, you can't just do something one time. And so could you talk a little bit about, you know, therapy in the sense of like, if I were seeking therapy, what might I expect initially? Very general, what I might expect initially about my commitment to therapy if that's a path I seek out. That was a very long winded question.
Yeah. I love the question, and if I forget any part of it, ask me. Um, oftentimes, like you said, people do reach out for therapy because something big has happened. We don't make changes in our lives when everything is good and we're like happy and skipping through life. It's kind of like if you're standing by a stove and you have your hand on the burner, you're not going to move unless the burner gets turned on and you're getting burned. And then you're like, "Oh, I have to treat this burn. I have to get away from that stove." But what happens is for so many of us, we're motivated to make a change because there's something external that's happening in life. And as soon as that external thing calms down, the motivation can go away. So, we're what we want to do in therapy is create inspiration, not motivation. Inspiration is more internal, motivation is more external. That can be hard because it really can be a long, slow process. Of course, there are the times where someone comes into therapy and within 2 to 3 sessions, they're like, "Oh, okay." And it's like this like light bulb. But so often for people, it's taking the time to go, okay, what are those things that are going on for me? The patterns that have been programmed subconsciously into my brain that I need to rework. And so when you're reworking something, you are creating new neural pathways in your brain. And a pathway is like imagine that there's a grass field and there's a path around it that you've been taking and the path is like well defined, but you want to cut directly diagonally across the field and it's tall grass. It's hard the first time, and then you cut across it again, and it's hard, and you cut across it again, and it's hard, and then eventually, as you keep going diagonal across that field over and over and over, you have a well-defined path, and therapy, for that reason, if people aren't ready for the whole path of walking through the hard over and over, it can feel like, "What am I doing here? What's the point of all of this?" And so, the therapist's job is to help people just understand that this is part of the package and that there is a curve. There's an emotional curve that comes with it. And the other thing about that curve is there is something called uninformed optimism when people start therapy. Like, I got it. They're optimistic because they don't know, but when you start doing the real work, it feels harder and that's informed pessimism. And then if you can get past the informed pessimism, then you get to the informed optimism. But it really is, it's like an upside down bell curve. And so it's just helping people to like keep showing up for themselves and doing the work because it's rarely easy and it's rarely quick.
So, in my own business, I'm very focused on professional development. And I'm just curious, a lot of the topics that I might coach someone on could also be topics that someone might come to therapy for. And, I often tell clients when they come that therapy is really about kind of like addressing some of the stuff in the past. And coaching is really very focused on like the future. Like, let's figure out like where we're going from where we are right now. And they work very nicely together. But I guess for people who might be listening who are a little bit more career focused, what are some things that they might be able to address through therapy that would help in like a professional
Mm.
environment?
Yeah. I think of coaching versus therapy as like a glacier. And the glacier, whatever is above water is in coaching, like you were saying, the future. And what's below water is all the stuff from the past. The way that we show up in the world is all programmed. There are so many things that we do naturally that have begun since we were babies. Because when you're a baby, you start watching the people around you and you see the way they respond and you know the unspoken rules in a household and the way that people respond in relationships, babies, children, teens, young adults, we're all soaking it up. And we don't realize that the things that we were a part of as children and in our early adulthood become a part of how we see ourselves in the world. And so for someone in a career, they may notice that if they get negative feedback or some constructive feedback at work, that it really brings them down. That maybe that kind of thing is like, it brings you down for the whole week or makes you feel like, okay, it's time to find a new job. And that can be related to the patterns that we have from childhood. It also can be that there our brains, naturally respond to things. And so if your amygdala is lighting up and you feel like, okay, I'm in fight, flight, freeze right now. I need to like get out of here, or I just like I'm overwhelmed. I can't do anything. That can be a trauma reaction. And so we carry around in our bodies all of our life experience, all of our childhood experiences. And we don't get to compartmentalize different parts of us when we show up at work. So, therapy can just help to do that internal work so that you have healthy ways of responding and create new patterns so that you show up in a way that feels good to you.
We didn't plan this out, Emily, but what you just said is so powerful to me because, part of the reason I talk so much about story, not because it's a, you know, foundational element of the human condition or the fact that telling stories helps us feel more connected to each other or even any of the like neuroscience stuff. The reason I think stories are so important is for what you just said. They impact so much of how we move through the world, how we experience our lives, how we, navigate workplace and relationships and all of these different things. And, so much of who we are before we know who we are is defined by some of that early story. And I don't know, it just hit for me when you were explaining like the ways that therapy could help in a professional environment. Because I think often we don't stop to reflect and think, oh, this experience that I had when I was 10 has now impacted how I navigate the world at 30 or 40. Stories are so powerful. And, I think it's helpful when we understand the impact of our stories. And then, of course, the goal of this podcast is for all of us to own our stories. And so, I don't know. I just want to say thank you. That really hit for me.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. It's funny because there's an experience I had when I was probably 4 years old that feels so minimal, but it's one of these things where I'm like, I've had reactions as an adult that are related to it. I went to the grocery store with my mom, and at the time, there were the little penny candy machines, like, you could get a little tiny gumball for a penny, and I brought a pocket full of pennies, and my mom was in the checkout lane, and I walked over to the little machine and put my penny in to get a gumball, and I was getting, like, 10 of them. I think I had 10 pennies, and one of the women who worked at the store came over and started yelling at me, and she was like, "What are you doing? Where's your mother?" And I was like, and she grabbed me by the arm and took me back to my mom and was like, Do you know what she was doing? She was getting all of the gum." And my mom was like, "Okay." My mom didn't care. But to this day, I have moments where I'm like, is someone going to get upset with me because I'm getting this thing? And it is like such a tiny moment that you would think wouldn't matter. I was 4, but it stuck with me, and that is part of why I mean, of course, there are many experiences like that, but it's part of why I'm like, "Oh, I don't wanna upset anyone. I don't want them to, like, think I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing."
I'm curious how this this perspective has sort of influenced your ability to overcome things like imposter syndrome and also like thinking about, engaging the world authentically, making meaning of your life. Like all these are really big topics. So I mean, take your time answering this question. But I'm just interested to know like how the impact of that early childhood experience has had on some of these sort of like big life topics because I think it ties really very closely to this idea of story and how stories impact, future.
Yeah. Well, and the stories that we have in our head, we tell them to ourselves over and over. I mean, we're alone with our thoughts all day, every day, and anything that we say over and over becomes a belief, and it's how we see ourselves, and So the story that I had about myself for a long time was that I'm quiet and I'm not the person who wants to get up in front of people because I don't really have anything to say and people don't want to hear from me. And that was the story that I had until I decided I didn't want that to be my story anymore. I wanted to be able to do something that would make an impact in one way or another. And to go back to what I was saying about fight, flight, freeze and the way that it shows up in our careers, we don't have to have some kind of like major childhood trauma, like, being in a severe car accident or your house burning down or, the things that people would normally think of as trauma in order to feel like there was something traumatic that happened because trauma is so subjective and it's so personal. And when you have an experience as a child, I mean, it can be that your parents divorced and that was really hard for you and it changed the way that you saw yourself and the way you thought about family. And when we can reprocess and create new stories about the things that have happened in life, we can then create new stories about who we are now. And that also is in line with creating new meaning. I mean, I don't have you ever read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl?
No.
Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who was Jewish and he was put into a concentration camp during the Holocaust. And he wrote this book. He survived the Holocaust because his purpose was to survive for his family. It turned out that his wife, who was pregnant, was killed during the Holocaust, but he didn't know at the time. And he wrote Man's Search for Meaning about survival and about suffering and the need for us all to have meaning and purpose. And what he talked about was the people who survived the concentration camps were the ones who had something they were looking forward to. The ones who didn't were the ones who had lost hope because as soon as people lost hope and felt like there was nothing outside of there, they would die. And that there was meaning in helping other people. And so part of our role as humans is that we we have to be able to do something bigger than ourselves. We have to be able to find meaning through other people. And so when I think about my own life, part of, the big picture for me is that I have wanted to help other people, that I have wanted to see myself as something more than just like a child who is hurt. I've wanted to do something that actually helps the world.
I guess that kind of brings me back, Emily, to one of the questions I asked earlier about, I talked about having basically the equivalent of boundaries, right, between sort of your personal and professional. And so often on this podcast, we've talked about how our careers can often become very intertwined with our identities. And kind of what I hear you saying is that your career was your identity before it was your career. And so I don't know if you could speak more to like a, if that's accurate, but then also B, how you navigate that to sort of maintain your own mental health, right? Because you did mention burnout in the helping professions earlier as well, and so I'm assuming there's probably more of a story there.
Right. Yeah, it's such an interesting thing because I'd like to think that I my identity is not about my career, but actually, Fran, who I saw as a teenager, she retired from being a therapist a long time ago, and we went to lunch last year, and we were talking, and she said, "Oh, no, Emily, you are identified with being a therapist." And I was like, "Oh my god, there you are again telling me." And it's just it is true that I am so proud of the work that I get to do, and I love what I get to do, and so I am identified with it. But one of the things when I was 35, I went through a divorce, and at that point, my kids were really little, and I had been so identified at that point in my life with like, okay, I'm a therapist, and therapist was little portion, but being a mom and a wife was really big for me. And so much of my identity was wrapped up in my immediate family. And in going through the divorce, I suddenly had to have split custody with my ex-husband. And the identity of being a wife was gone. So I had all this shame about like, I failed. I'm no longer in this marriage. I couldn't make it work. And then I had to work on the identity piece about what am I if I'm not a mom? Because half of the time my kids weren't there. And I was devastated. It was really at that point in my life when I was crying every time they left to go to their dad's that I had to look at myself and go, well, okay, who am I? And that's when I did a lot of work on myself. I mean, of course, like I had done work before that, but I had to really shift my identity. And through therapy and personal development reading and journaling and, lots of different things that I did at that point. But I think our identities are wrapped up in the current moment sometimes. And we get the permission, we have to give ourselves the permission to shift that we're not all one thing. We're layered and our identity can be wrapped up in our job, but it's not all of who we are. W- It it's just a part and it may be a really important part, but it's a part of who we are.
Sorry, Emily, I'm just sort of taking that in for a second because it's like, I mean, I agree with you, right? And I think it's
Mhm.
always easy to see when I think it's easy to get very wrapped up in your job because it does sometimes help give meaning to things. And so earlier when you were talking about, wanting to like to have your life mean more than sort of the sum of its parts, and some of those early experiences. And I'm just thinking a little bit even about my own story. Growing up blue collar, I remember as I mentioned in the last episode, there were times where we didn't have much and there were other times when we things felt very abundant. And so I had sort of these like very contrasting experiences. And I had, these lessons from my family saying like go to school, get good grades, get an education because you don't want to have to do hard labor. And so all of these sort of early things, right? Someone asked me once, they said, "Heather, what are you running from?" And I said, "Well, I'm both running from something, but I'm also trying to run to something." And so I like for me, I think that just ties to this concept of like meaning making. And so in my own journey, my own story, that is very much tied to some of my career story. And like I think like it's very easy for us to attach meaning to our lives through our career. So that's like part of it. But then I also think that sometimes, you know, when something bad happens, we realize what you just said, that like our career doesn't define us. It's just one little like sliver of who we are. And I mean, we don't work for our whole lives, right? We work for just a portion. And then within that portion, we have different roles and responsibilities. We work at different companies. We might do different types of, jobs and things. And so we kind of build this collective where it's like, this is a big part of who I am. But in the grand scheme of things, it's actually not.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I do want to pivot a little bit here, Emily, and talk about gratitude because I know just from knowing you that gratitude is a really big part of your practice. And so I would love to hear your perspective just on gratitude, what's your approach to gratitude? Do you have any recommendations for people who might want to incorporate more gratitude into their own lives, and then why? Why take the time to do it?
Yeah. Gratitude is such an incredible thing. It's I think we can go, "Oh," there's the typical, "I'm grateful for my family, I'm grateful for my health." But really, when you stop and you go, "What does that mean to me on a deeper level?" Like, if of course I'm grateful for my family, but it's like when I am with my family and my son wants to come and, like, cuddle with me, he wants to, like, sit with me and talk to me, I'm grateful for those moments because these are the moments when I feel connected to him. Or when I get to go outside and be in nature, I feel grateful because there's something really beautiful about being in nature and you like whether it's like snowy and you get to feel the snow like hit your skin or it's sunny and you feel the sun and like the vitamin D, just imagine the vitamin D entering your body. There's something really amazing. But it's not just like, oh, I like gratitude. There is a ton of science behind why gratitude works. And there there is scientific research about the benefit of gratitude helping cardiac patients. So there was one study where there were cardiac patients who were basically in failure and they split them into two groups In one group, they asked them to journal 5 things they were grateful for each night, and the other group continued treatment as normal. And after 8 weeks, they did a questionnaire to ask these participants about things. They ran scans and they checked inflammation within their body. And the people who had done gratitude had better cardiac rates, had either moved up in their category and weren't as high risk, or they had remained at the same level and they had less inflammation. And the group that had continued treatment as normal had declined. Everyone had. And so there is there is a physiological benefit of gratitude. It changes how our bodies are responding to the world. It changes how our brains are wired. And so when I was talking about earlier crossing that field diagonally, if we start to add in a gratitude practice every day and we do it over and over and over, it becomes this natural thing. So you have a path and you have a new neural pathway in your brain and you actually start to find things that you're grateful for that you maybe wouldn't have noticed without the practice. So it helps. And of course, then it helps in our relationships because it helps in how we see ourselves. And if we are feeling like, okay, I'm happy with myself and how I'm showing up, we are going to be different in whether it's an intimate relationship or a friendship or with our children or our parents. So it's really cool. And I am starting a 66-day gratitude challenge that's free. And it is just for people to be able to have the support to create a new habit of gratitude. And then by the end of the challenge, hopefully everyone is doing it on their own and feeling like this is a thing that's just part of my life.
Is there significance to 66?
Yeah. That is the average amount of time it takes to create a new habit. People often think it's like 27 or 28 days, and that number came from a plastic surgeon who would do surgeries, and when he saw that patients were doing better post-surgery, it was usually about 27 or 28 days, but 66 is the number that it's on average, so it's not exact, but it's on average that it takes people to create a new habit.
Very, very cool. Well, we'll be sure to include some information about your gratitude challenge in the show notes. But we are coming to the end of our episode, Emily, and I love to wrap each episode by saying if someone said this episode was too long, I did not listen. What is the one thing you'd want them to take away from this conversation?
I want people to know that they are in charge of their lives. That if they want to change something about how they're showing up in the world or about the way that a pattern, something that is happening in their life over and over, they get to choose that and they get to choose how they're responding to it. And so I want people to remember that they have power over changing their lives.
So you heard it here. Emily just said, if I'm going to sum it up, own your story. And
Yes.
on that note, I am going to say thank you so much, Emily, for being on the show.
Thanks, Heather.
If you enjoyed this episode and are seeking to redefine success on your own terms, subscribe to Small Acts of Rebellion and join a community that celebrates authenticity and personal growth.